My name is Dorothy. I am 71 years old, a widow, and for most of my life I devoted myself to being a mother. I never ran a company or held a glamorous career. My work was raising my daughter, keeping our home steady after my husband passed, and stretching every dollar I had saved from his pension and the small bookkeeping jobs I took to keep us afloat. I thought my reward for those years of sacrifice would be to watch my daughter walk down the aisle with a smile that belonged to me as much as to her. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I finally worked up the courage to call and ask about the wedding. The invitations had gone out weeks earlier, but none had ever reached me. I told myself maybe it was a mistake at the post office. Maybe she was planning a surprise. Maybe anything at all except the truth. When the line clicked and Victor, my son-in-law, answered, I felt my chest tighten. His voice carried that polished arrogance, the kind that pretends to be polite but is meant to remind you who holds the power. I asked quietly, Victor, when is the wedding day? I don't want to miss it. There was a pause, and then I heard it. A sharp laugh, short and cold, sliding through the receiver like a blade. We only wanted our real family there. For a moment, I couldn't even process the words. Real family. What did that make me? I had carried Claire for 9 months, raised her through measles and heartbreaks, worked late nights so she could take ballet lessons, and sat up countless evenings beside her bed when nightmares wouldn't let her sleep. My whole existence had been proof of my place in her life. Yet in that single sentence, Victor erased me. I pressed the phone closer, waiting for Claire to interrupt, to rush in, to say it wasn't true. But there was only silence. I could picture her standing nearby, perhaps staring at the floor, her lips pressed shut, as though they had been stitched by fear. My daughter's silence was heavier than Victor's cruelty. When the call ended, I sat still in the living room chair, the faded curtains glowing with late sunlight. The house was too quiet. My hands rested on my lap, one holding the other, and I realized I had been gripping so tightly that the veins bulged. My heart pounded in my ears, not just from humiliation, but from the crushing realization that I had been erased from the most important moment in my daughter's life. The following day, the humiliation grew deeper. A neighbor sent me a link to photos posted online. Claire in her white dress, Victor in his tuxedo, the church decorated with roses and soft candlelight. His side of the family stood proudly in each shot, smiling, laughing, arms around each other. I searched frame after frame, my eyes desperate for any glimpse of myself, but I was not there. My name had been crossed out long before the vows were spoken. That night, I sat by the mirror in my bedroom. I lifted my old silk handkerchief, the one embroidered with tiny flowers I had once given to Claire when she was little and afraid of thunderstorms. She used to press it to her face and whisper that it smelled like home. I held it now against my cheek, staring into the reflection of a woman who looked like a ghost at her own child's celebration. The mirror showed me lines carved by years of sacrifice, eyes reddened from tears that no one else would ever see. I whispered to my reflection, so this is what it means to be unwanted. I thought of the mansion, $10 million worth of stone and glass, bought with Harold's life insurance, and the decades of saving I had done afterward. I had given Claire and Victor the chance to live there, believing they would treat it as a foundation for family. It was supposed to be our legacy, a sanctuary. Instead, it had become their ambition, their prize. When Victor laughed at me on the phone, he thought he had taken away my dignity. But what he didn't understand was that dignity can hide in silence, waiting for its moment to rise. I felt the first ember of something inside me that night, not rage, but clarity. They had closed the doors of the church to me, but I still held the keys to the mansion, and keys are sometimes heavier than crowns. The days that followed blurred into a strange mixture of grief and resolve. I moved through the house in measured steps, touching the carved banister Harold once polished, opening the windows to let the autumn air clear out the staleness of betrayal. I was beginning to see that my life was not over. The story was not finished just because they had written me out of theirs. When my phone rang again a few days later, it was Victor. This time, his voice carried urgency instead of arrogance. "We can't open the mansion," he said, frustration snapping through his words. "Did you leave the right key?" I listened for the sound of Claire behind him, some sign that she wanted to speak, but again she was silent. My answer was calm, even measured. "The mansion? Didn't you get my warning?" There was a pause on the line, then the call cut out. I set the phone down slowly, my handkerchief resting beneath it like a witness to the moment. I had been told I was not real family, but I was about to show them what real family meant when you betrayed the one person who had given you everything. And if you are listening to my story now, perhaps you've lived through a moment when the people you loved most made you feel like an outsider in your own life. If you have, I invite you to stay with me. This journey is not only about betrayal, it is about finding strength again, about the quiet kind of justice that comes when you finally decide to stop begging for a place and begin claiming your own. Don't forget to subscribe and share this story with someone who needs to hear that it is never too late to stand up for your worth. Your support allows stories like mine to reach those who are searching for hope. The morning after Victor's call, I woke with a heaviness that clung to me like damp air. The mansion was silent, but in my head his words kept echoing. Real family. I had tried to sleep with the windows cracked open, hoping the cool autumn air would clear my mind, but the memory of that laugh had settled into my chest like a stone. I rose slowly, folding my blanket across the bed the way Harold always had, neat corners and smooth edges, as though order could restore dignity. When I shuffled into the kitchen, my neighbor Ellen had left a message on my answering machine. She spoke in a tone that carried pity, the way people sound when they don't know how to tell you something that might break you further. "Dorothy, I saw the photos online," she said softly. "I thought you should know." With shaking hands, I opened my laptop. The screen lit up with dozens of bright images. Claire in her gown, her veil pinned perfectly, standing beneath an arch of white roses. My breath caught at how radiant she looked, the same glow she used to have as a child on Christmas morning when she rushed down the stairs in her flannel pajamas. But this time, I was not the one she rushed toward. In photo after photo, I saw Victor's parents, smiling proudly. His sisters held Claire's bouquet between them in playful poses. Aunts, uncles, cousins filled the frame. Their laughter seemed almost audible through the screen. And then the truth seared into me like a burn. Every seat filled, every smile in place, yet not one space left for me. Scrolling further, I found the official caption. "A perfect day with our family, celebrating love." I stared at the word "our," my name, my face, my existence, erased with a single pronoun. I pressed my palm against the table, steadying myself as the room tilted. My eyes blurred, and for a moment I thought of slamming the laptop shut, but my body refused to move. It was as though I needed to see the proof of my absence, to let the pain pierce all the way through before I could stand again. There was one picture that nearly undid me. Claire stood with Victor's mother, their arms linked, her head resting against the woman's shoulder. I had not seen Claire lean on me like that in years, not since Harold's funeral, when grief had forced her to cling to me. In that image, she looked safe, as though she had found a replacement for what I had been. My stomach tightened, and for a moment, I wanted to reach into the screen, to shake her, to remind her who had carried her when she was too small to walk, who had braided her hair before her first recital, who had cheered from the back row of every graduation. But there was no sound for my protest, only silence. I closed the laptop finally, pushing it away, but the damage was done. The humiliation of being told I was not wanted had deepened into the public reality of being erased. A whole room full of strangers had witnessed her vows, toasted her happiness, and sealed my exile with applause. I walked to the mantel and picked up a framed photograph. It was Claire at age 6, her gap-toothed smile lighting up the frame, her little arms wrapped around a stuffed rabbit. Her cheeks were round, her eyes full of mischief. I pressed the frame against my chest, and a sob tore through me before I could stop it. The silence of the mansion made my grief louder. Every sound echoed, the creak of the floorboards beneath me, the tick of the clock in the hallway, the rasp of my breath catching in my throat. I sank into the armchair by the window and pulled my old handkerchief into my hands. The stitches were loosening at the edges, but the flowers were still bright. I thought of how Claire once cried when I first handed it to her after she scraped her knee, how she had held it like a treasure. And now she had traded me for roses in a church where I was a ghost. Hours passed. The light shifted across the living room walls, fading from morning gold to the pale gray of afternoon. I sat unmoving, clutching that photo frame, my handkerchief, the remnants of a life where I mattered. It wasn't only rejection I felt. It was the sense that my daughter's memory of me had been rewritten, that all the years of love and sacrifice had been cropped out of the picture like an unwanted shadow. By evening, I rose and walked to the mirror in the hallway. My reflection met me with weary eyes, but behind the sorrow there was a question rising. What will you do now? Betrayal had stripped me down to the bone, but somewhere in the hollow space, I felt the faint stir of resolve. They had humiliated me in front of the world, but they had not yet seen what a mother could do when silence had run its course. The phone rang 3 nights later, just as the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 8. Its chime echoed through the mansion, a sound Harold had always loved because it made the house feel alive. I reached for the receiver slowly, expecting perhaps Ellen or Marjorie checking in. Instead, the line opened with Victor's voice, sharp and impatient. "We can't open the mansion," he snapped, skipping any greeting. "The key doesn't fit." "Did you leave us the wrong one?" For a moment I said nothing, letting the weight of his words settle. He had not called to ask how I was, not to mend anything with Claire, not even to soften the cruelty of excluding me from the wedding. No, he called because he wanted access to what he believed belonged to him. I asked quietly, "And why do you think you should have the key?" There was a pause, then the sound of muffled voices in the background. I thought I could hear Claire's breath, soft and uneven, but she didn't speak. Victor's tone grew harder. "Because this house is ours now. Claire and I are married. Family assets belong to family. We need to move things in and I don't have time for games." I closed my eyes and felt the cold weight of those words press against me. Hours now. He said it as though Harold and I had built nothing, as though decades of saving, planning, and sacrifice could be erased by a signature on a marriage license. "The mansion?" I said finally, my voice calm and steady. "Didn't you get my warning?" The line went silent. For the first time, Victor had no quick retort. I imagined him gripping the phone tighter, his jaw clenched. Claire's hush in the background cut sharper than any blade. I waited, letting the silence stretch until he muttered something under his breath and hung up. I set the receiver back into its cradle, my hand trembling not from fear, but from the clarity of what had just happened. Victor had revealed himself fully. The wedding, the performance of family unity, the smiles in those photos, they were all part of his theater. But here, stripped of witnesses, he was nothing but greed. I rose from the chair and walked the length of the living room. My footsteps echoed against the marble floor Harold had chosen decades earlier, each step reminding me of the foundation he had worked so hard to leave behind. I touched the banister as I climbed the stairs, remembering how Harold used to run his hand along the same curve and say, "This house will outlive us both, Dorothy. Take care of it." Inside my study, I unlocked the drawer where I kept the documents. Property deeds, insurance papers, bank records, every proof that the mansion was mine alone. My fingers traced the raised notary seal, firm evidence against the false confidence in Victor's voice. He might shout, demand, or mock, but the truth was bound in these pages. I thought again of Claire. Was she standing behind him when he made that call? Her hands twisting nervously, her lips pressed tight so no protest could escape? Did she know the cost of his arrogance? Or had she convinced herself that this was the only way to survive beside him? I wanted to believe that inside her, the little girl who once clung to my handkerchief still lived. But each silence chipped away at that hope. I returned to the mirror in the hallway, the same one I had stared into after the photos. The reflection met me with eyes that no longer belonged to a victim. They belonged to a woman who had been tested and was beginning to see her own strength again. The mansion loomed around me, its walls carrying memories of Harold's laughter, Claire's childhood songs, my own sleepless nights after widowhood. It was not a prize for Victor to claim. It was a battlefield, and I was not finished fighting. That night, I brewed a cup of chamomile tea and sat by the window overlooking the garden. The roses had begun to wilt in the cooling weather, their petals falling like quiet witnesses to endings and beginnings. I held my cup with both hands and whispered to myself, "If they think I am weak, they will learn." When the phone remained silent for the rest of the evening, I allowed myself one small smile. Victor would stew in his frustration, planning his next move, but he had underestimated me. I was no longer waiting for invitations that never came. I was preparing for a confrontation on my own terms. The mansion's lights flickered as I walked through the rooms before bed. Each corner carried the weight of history, but tonight it also carried something new, a sense of readiness. I pulled the curtains shut, laid the handkerchief gently on my bedside table, and let the stillness wrap around me like armor. I knew the calls, the visits, the demands would not stop. But for the first time since that cruel sentence, real family, I no longer felt erased. I felt steady. They had locked me out of their wedding, but I had locked them out of the mansion. And that was only the beginning. The following morning, sunlight crept across the hardwood floor of my bedroom, slipping between the curtains I had forgotten to close the night before. I sat up slowly, my body heavier than it should have been, as though grief had added years overnight. I padded toward the bathroom, and as I reached for the faucet, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The woman who stared back was one I barely recognized. Deep lines framed my mouth, my eyes were swollen, and my shoulders slumped forward like a tree bending under storms too long endured. I studied that reflection for a long moment. The mirror had always been my witness, through weddings, funerals, and lonely evenings. But today, it seemed more like an accuser. It asked me questions I did not want to answer. How had I ended up here? Why had I given so much to Claire and Victor, only to be discarded like an unwanted guest at the edge of their new life? I turned away from the mirror and opened the drawer beneath the sink where I kept a box filled with old receipts and canceled checks. Years of careful record-keeping stared back at me, black ink chronicling my sacrifices. I carried the box into the bedroom, set it on the quilt, and began sorting through the papers. One slip showed the down payment I had given Victor when he lost his job years ago, $40,000 I had withdrawn from Harold's life insurance. Another check revealed $10,000 for Claire's graduate program. There were bills for wedding planners, caterers, and even the designer dress Claire had once said she couldn't afford. The numbers added up with cruel precision. By the time I stacked the last paper, the total reached nearly $250,000. $250,000. That was what it had cost me to buy my way into their gratitude. A gratitude that had vanished the moment Victor decided I was no longer useful. I sat on the bed, the papers spread around me like autumn leaves fallen from a tree that had been stripped bare. My hands trembled as I picked one up. I could almost remember the feeling I had when I signed it, the hope that this time, this act of generosity, would make Claire proud of me, would make Victor see me as more than an obstacle. Each slip was not just money. It was a piece of my dignity, chipped away bit by bit, disguised as kindness. The longer I stared, the more the realization settled in. I had allowed this. I had mistaken sacrifice for love, mistaking silence for peace. I had believed that if I gave enough, one day my daughter would stand firmly beside me, proud to call me her mother. Instead, I had purchased my own erasure. I pressed my palms against my face, the edges of the old handkerchief brushing my skin. I remembered handing that handkerchief to Claire when she was 5 years old, after she scraped her knee on the playground. She had looked up at me with tears in her eyes, clutching the cloth as though it were treasure. "Thank you, Mommy," she had whispered then. That little girl was still etched somewhere inside her, but I no longer knew how to reach her through the layers of fear and control Victor had wrapped around her. I walked back to the mirror. My reflection waited patiently, the same tired eyes meeting mine. I leaned closer and spoke aloud, my voice low but certain. "You have given enough, Dorothy. More than enough. It's time to stop." The words surprised me. They sounded foreign at first, but then they rang true. I realized the mirror was no longer accusing me. It was bearing witness to a vow. I would not write another check, not sign another paper, not hand over another piece of my life to people who saw me as expendable. I gathered the receipts back into the box and placed it carefully on the shelf in my closet. It was not shame I felt anymore. It was clarity. Those papers were evidence, reminders of how far I had gone and why I could not go further. They were no longer symbols of loss. They were warnings carved in ink. Before I left the room, I looked once more into the mirror. My reflection still looked old, still worn, but behind the wrinkles, I caught a glimpse of the woman Harold had once believed in, the woman who could stand her ground when the world pushed her down. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and in that moment, the air in the mansion felt different, lighter, but also sharper, like the edge of a blade being honed. I stepped away from the glass with a new steadiness in my stride. They had taken my place at the wedding. They had tried to take my dignity, but I still held something they could never erase, the choice to rise again. The morning air carried a bite as I stepped out of the mansion, locking the heavy oak door behind me. I tightened my coat around my shoulders and walked slowly to the car Harold had left me years ago. Its leather seats were cracked with age, but it started on the first turn of the key, humming like an old friend ready for one more journey. My destination was the bank downtown, a place I had visited countless times with Harold when we were younger. Back then, our visits had been filled with quiet pride, the two of us carefully depositing savings, dreaming of security for our family. Today, I carried no pride. I carried only resolve. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and ink, just as it always had. The clerk smiled politely, though one or two glanced at me with that soft pity reserved for widows who seem fragile. I kept my chin high as I approached the counter and asked for Mr. Ross, the branch manager who had handled our accounts for decades. Within minutes, I was seated in his office, its glass walls overlooking the bustling floor below. "Dorothy," he greeted warmly, though his brow furrowed as he took in my expression. "It's been some time. What brings you in?" I laid the folder of documents on his desk, my hand steady. "I need to revoke every power of attorney associated with my accounts," I said clearly. "Every one of them, and I want all withdrawals frozen until my signature is verified in person." His eyes widened slightly. "That's a significant change. Are you certain?" I nodded. "I am certain, and I want it effective immediately." Mr. Ross leaned back, folding his hands. "If you don't mind me asking, has someone been pressuring you?" These requests usually come after certain concerns arise. I met his gaze without flinching. "You've known me for years. Have I ever come here without thinking things through?" He gave a small smile. "No." Never still, his expression grew more serious. He lowered his voice, as though the glass walls could not shield us from the truth outside. "Dorothy, I've been working in this field for a long time. I've seen situations where older clients are targeted by their own families. Sometimes it begins with small favors, signing papers, adding names to accounts, and before long, everything is gone. Forgive me, but I have to ask, is this about your daughter or her husband?" The words cut deep, but I held myself firm. "You could say it is. I've given more than I should have, and I won't give any more. Not money, not my name, not my dignity." He studied me carefully, then nodded. "All right, I'll process the revocation today. You'll receive confirmation in writing. And, Dorothy," his voice softened, "you're doing the right thing. Protect yourself." As he printed the forms, I sat silently, listening to the soft hum of the printer. Each page felt like a stone laid into the foundation of a new fortress. I signed with deliberate strokes, my pen pressing firmly enough to leave indents in the paper. When the final sheet was stacked neatly into a file, Mr. Ross slid it across to me. "There," he said. "Your accounts are secured. No one can touch them but you." I folded the folder against my chest, as though it were a shield. "Thank you." When I stepped back into the street, The autumn wind tugged at my coat. I paused on the sidewalk, watching the traffic flow around me, and realized I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The humiliation of being erased from my daughter's wedding still ached like an old wound. But now, for the first time, I felt the balance shift. They might have taken my place in the church, but they would not take the rest of my life. Driving home, I thought about Claire. Had she known about the accounts? Had she whispered my financial details to Victor in the hope of easing his debts? Or had she simply allowed herself to be led by his voice, choosing silence again over loyalty? The questions twisted inside me, but I no longer let them rule me. The documents in my bag were proof that I could still act. When I reached the mansion, I walked slowly up the steps, pausing at the door. I pressed my hand against the cool stone of the archway and whispered, "Harold, I'm keeping it safe." For both of us inside, the house seemed to breathe with me. The quiet was no longer suffocating. It was resolute. I placed the folder carefully inside the locked drawer of my study and sat at the desk, staring out the tall window at the trees swaying in the evening breeze. I knew Victor would not give up easily. Men like him never did. He would scheme, push, and manipulate until he believed he had won. But tonight, the ground beneath him had shifted. His arrogance had made him blind to the fact that I still had choices. And I had just made one he could never undo. The mirror at the end of the hallway caught my reflection as I rose. My face still bore the lines of sorrow, but there was something new around my eyes, a glint of steadiness, of quiet defiance. I reached for the handkerchief on the table, smoothing its embroidered edges, and whispered again, "Enough." For the first time in weeks, I slept without tears. It happened on a damp Friday evening, just as the sky turned the color of steel and the first drops of rain tapped against the tall windows of the mansion. I had been reading in the study, the folder of banking documents still close at hand, when the sound of tires crunching over gravel made me look up. Through the lace curtains, I saw a black car pulling into the driveway. My stomach tightened. Visitors were rare, and none were welcome without warning. The knock at the front door came sharp and insistent. I hesitated, then opened it to find Victor standing there in his tailored coat, his arm gripping Claire's hand. Behind them stood a man I had never met, carrying a leather briefcase. His smile was thin, professional, the kind that never reaches the eyes. "Dorothy," Victor said smoothly, though his grip on Claire's wrist betrayed impatience. "This is Mr. Denton, our attorney. We thought it best to stop by and take care of some paperwork." For everyone's benefit, I glanced at Claire. Her eyes darted to mine, then away. I saw her lips part as though to speak, but before a word could leave, Victor squeezed her hand tightly. She fell silent. "I didn't ask for an attorney," I said, my voice firm. Denton's smile sharpened. "Sometimes it's wise to have one anyway. These forms are simple, just a matter of signing a power of attorney. That way, Victor and Claire can help you manage things. Less stress for you." The word manage landed like a stone in my chest. I thought of the mirror, of Mr. Ross's warning, of the countless sacrifices that had already been twisted into obligations. And now they wanted more. My signature, my freedom, my autonomy. Victor stepped forward, holding out a pen. "Mother, it's just a formality. You're alone here. Things get complicated at your age. We only want to protect you." The rain thickened outside, streaking the windows with silver. I could hear the patter like 1,000 small accusations. My handkerchief was in my pocket, and I gripped it, its threads grounding me in the storm. I looked at Claire again. For a fleeting second, I saw something flicker across her face. Pleading, maybe shame. Her lips parted once more, and this time a whisper slipped out, so faint I almost missed it. "Mom." But Victor's hand tightened around hers, his jaw clenching. She lowered her head, silenced once again. "I will not sign anything," I said, my voice steady, carrying more steel than I had expected. Denton laid the papers on the table anyway, sliding them toward me. "I advise you to reconsider. It's for your own good. Judges don't look kindly on the elderly who resist reasonable help. It could be interpreted as confusion, even incapacity." The air in the room grew heavier. He was not offering help. He was issuing a threat. I took a step closer, letting my eyes lock with his. "I am not confused. I am not incapable. And I am certainly not signing away my life to satisfy your client's debts." Victor's mask of charm cracked. "You think you can keep this house from us? After everything we've done for you?" His tone dripped with false indignation, but his eyes betrayed the hunger beneath. "You've done nothing for me," I answered quietly. "It was I who built this life. I who paid the bills. I who raised Claire. And I will not let you erase that with one signature." For a long moment, the only sound was the rain hammering against the glass. Denton cleared his throat, gathering the unsigned papers back into his briefcase. "We'll return," he said simply, his professional calm hiding the menace in his promise. Victor turned sharply, pulling Claire with him. As they stepped back onto the porch, she looked at me one last time. Her eyes glistened, wide and frightened, but she said nothing. The door closed between us with a heavy thud that echoed through the mansion. I stood in the silence, my chest heaving, the handkerchief still clutched in my fist. My knees trembled, but I forced myself to stand tall. They had tried to corner me in my own home, to strip me of my will. And though fear pulsed in my veins, there was something else too: resolve. I walked slowly to the hallway mirror. My reflection met me again, pale and tired, but with a spark glowing beneath. "Not this time," I whispered. The mirror seemed to nod, back, its silence more powerful than their threats. That night, I double-locked the doors, checked every window, and placed the folder of documents beneath my pillow like a shield. The rain continued long into the night, but instead of lulling me into despair, it felt like a cleansing. They had brought their storm to my doorstep, but I had refused to drown. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, rehearsing their words in my mind. Confusion, incapacity. They would use every weapon they could, even the law, even my own daughter's silence. But I had faced their first invasion and endured. I would be ready for the next. That night the mansion was too quiet. Every creak of the beams and every sigh of the wind against the shutters magnified in the silence. After the confrontation at the door, after watching Claire's eyes plead for something she could not say aloud, I wandered the halls unable to rest. The lamps cast long shadows across the wallpaper, stretching shapes that looked like reaching hands. The storm had passed, leaving the air heavy with dampness, but inside me another storm still raged. I carried the handkerchief in my palm as I drifted from room to room. The embroidered flowers brushed against my skin, worn but resilient, a reminder of moments when I was needed, when a child's tears had been dried by my hand. Tonight the cloth was damp again, not from Claire's childhood sobs, but from my own unspoken grief. In the living room, the mirror above the fireplace caught my reflection. I paused, standing before it in the dim light. My face looked smaller somehow, framed by the vastness of the mansion's high ceilings and wide walls. Behind me, the furniture stood like silent witnesses, the armchairs Harold had chosen, the shelves lined with books I had read to Claire when she was little. Everything in this house bore my fingerprints, and yet Victor had tried to make me feel like an intruder. I leaned forward, staring into my own tired eyes. "You will not bend anymore," I whispered. The voice that came back was faint, but it steadied me. "You will not sign. You will not surrender." The weight of years pressed against me then, the long history of sacrifices that had led to this moment. I remembered the days after Harold died, when I would sit in the same room staring at bills I didn't know how to pay, determined to keep a roof over Claire's head no matter the cost. I remembered the nights I skipped meals so she could eat, the vacations never taken, the clothes bought secondhand so she could have what was new. I had always told myself it was worth it, that one day she would understand. But tonight, that belief had cracked. Still, something stronger than despair began to rise in me. It was not the hope that Claire would change, though some fragile part of me still prayed for it. It was the knowledge that I could change. I was no longer the young widow begging the world to show me mercy. I was the woman who had endured, who had built this fortress brick by brick, dollar by dollar, and who would not allow it to be stolen under the guise of care. I walked to the window, drawing the curtains back to look at the night outside. The garden glistened under the moonlight, wet leaves sparkling like shards of glass. I pressed my forehead against the cool pane, breathing slowly until my reflection blurred. In that moment, I swore silently to myself. I would not let Victor win. I would not let Claire's silence define me. I would fight, not with screaming or chaos, but with steadiness. If they wanted a battle, I would wage it on my own ground, with my own weapons, patience, evidence, and resolve. I pulled the curtains closed and turned off every light but one. In the half-dark, the mansion felt like a sanctuary again, its silence no longer oppressive but protective. I touched the wall as I walked down the hallway, whispering to Harold as though he were still walking beside me. "You built this for us. I'll keep it safe. I promise." Upstairs, I stopped by Claire's old bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. I hadn't entered in months, not since she'd moved out with Victor. Pushing it open now, I was greeted by the faint scent of lavender from the sachets I used to tuck into her drawers. Her posters still clung to the walls, curling at the edges. On the dresser, a small jewelry box sat open, inside it a tiny ring I had given her when she turned 16. I picked it up, running my fingers over the band. For a brief second, I could almost hear her laughter filling the room again, see her sprawled across the bed with a magazine, calling me in to ask about prom dresses. The ache that rose in me was nearly unbearable. But beneath the ache was something sharper, a refusal to let those memories be trampled by Victor's schemes. I returned to my own room, set the handkerchief carefully on the bedside table, and sat on the edge of the bed. The darkness wrapped around me, and into that darkness I spoke clearly, almost ceremoniously. I will not surrender my name. I will not surrender my mind. I will not surrender this house. I will endure. I will fight. And when the time comes, they will know the cost of underestimating me. The words seemed to echo in the stillness, binding themselves to the walls. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of peace, The vow was made. My loneliness had been turned into a weapon, not of destruction, but of survival. As I lay back against the pillows, the storm outside had fully passed. The night was calm, the air still damp but cleaner. I closed my eyes and clutched the handkerchief gently. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was steady. The house, my mirror, my memories, all of them had heard my vow. The next morning, the vow I had whispered in the dark still pulsed inside me like a steady drumbeat. It guided my steps as I brewed coffee, dressed carefully, and gathered the courage to do something I had put off for too long. I could no longer rely on hope that Claire would speak up for me, or that Victor would grow weary of his games. I needed protection, not just resolve. And protection meant the law. I drove into the city, the streets crowded with morning commuters and honking horns. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, but my mind was clear. Harold used to say that every fortress needs its sentry, someone who can stand guard when the walls are threatened. Today, I would find mine. The law office of Evelyn Carter sat in a modest brick building tucked between a coffee shop and a pharmacy. There was no grandeur to it, no marble floors or intimidating pillars, but the brass plaque by the door bore her name with quiet authority. I had learned of her from a brochure Ellen once handed me, a pamphlet about resources for older adults at risk of exploitation. I had tucked it away, embarrassed at the time. Now I pulled it from my bag with shaking fingers before stepping inside. The receptionist greeted me kindly and led me to a waiting room lined with shelves of thick law books. My eyes lingered on the titles, statutes about guardianship, property rights, elder protection. Each volume seemed to whisper that I was not as powerless as Victor wanted me to believe. When Evelyn entered, she carried herself with a steadiness that immediately eased my nerves. She was in her early 60s, her hair silver at the temples, her suit practical but sharp. Her eyes held none of the pity I had grown used to. Instead, they carried focus, as if she had already decided I was worth fighting for. "Dorothy," she said warmly, shaking my hand. "I'm glad you came. Why don't you tell me what's been happening?" The words spilled from me faster than I expected. I told her about the phone call, the photographs of the wedding, the late-night invasion with Denton and his papers, the way Claire's silence had cut deeper than Victor's arrogance. I told her about the money, the checks that added up to $250,000, and about my visit to the bank to revoke every permission I had once given. My voice trembled at times, but Evelyn's calm gaze steadied me. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled. "You've been wise to act already. Revoking the powers of attorney, documenting your expenses. That was smart. But what you're facing is more than family conflict. This is coercion. It's manipulation. In plain terms, it's elder abuse." The word struck me, sharp and unfamiliar. Abuse. I had thought of it as betrayal, humiliation, greed. But to call it abuse made it heavier, and yet oddly clarifying. It was not simply my weakness. It was their crime. Evelyn continued, her tone steady. "They'll likely try again. They may file for guardianship, claiming you can't manage your affairs. They may use false witnesses, exaggerate your age, twist your words. But you're not alone. My firm specializes in this. And Dorothy, I want you to understand something. You are not powerless. You have rights, and you can fight this." For the first time in weeks, I felt my shoulders loosen. Someone believed me. Someone named the thing I had been too ashamed to admit. "What do I need to do?" I asked. "First, document everything. she said firmly. Every call, every visit, every word they try to twist against you. Keep a journal, time-stamped. Second, strengthen your home security. If they intrude again, we'll have evidence. And third, don't speak to them without me present. If they want to push this through legal channels, then that's where we'll meet them, on ground where their intimidation carries no weight. I nodded, relief and fear intertwining inside me. And if they take me to court? Then we'll show the court exactly who they are, she said, her voice firm as stone. I've seen men like Victor. They think intimidation is power. But when confronted with truth, with evidence, with the strength of a woman who refuses to be erased, they crumble. Her words sank into me like warmth on a winter morning. I had walked into her office with dread, fearing confirmation that I was defenseless. I was walking out with something stronger, a shield forged in law, held by someone who understood the battlefield I faced. As we wrapped up, Evelyn placed her hand gently over mine. Dorothy, the fact that you're here tells me everything I need to know. You're not a victim, you're a fighter, and you don't have to do this alone anymore. When I left the office, the city felt different. The air was still brisk, the sidewalks still noisy, but I no longer felt small among them. I walked taller, the handkerchief tucked securely in my pocket, its embroidered flowers pressed against my palm like a seal of the vow I had made. Only now, that vow had found an ally. Driving back toward the mansion, I whispered aloud, "Let them come." The day after meeting Evelyn, I woke with a sharper sense of purpose. Her words still echoed in my head. Document everything, secure your home, never face them without proof. I brewed my coffee, walked through the silent mansion, and for the first time since Victor's sneer of real family, I felt like the house, and I were no longer just waiting for betrayal. We were preparing. By mid-morning, Marcus arrived. He was recommended by a neighbor who once had trouble with break-ins. A man in his 40s, Marcus had the kind of practical calm I trusted immediately. He carried 2 toolboxes and a laptop bag, his boots leaving faint prints on the polished floor as he entered. "Mrs. Turner," he greeted, tipping his cap politely. Evelyn filled me in. "I know what you're up against. Let's get you set up." He walked me through every corner of the mansion, studying door frames, windows, and hallways with an eye that missed nothing. "You've got space working both for you and against you," he explained. "The house is strong, but it's big. That gives them plenty of shadows to slip through. Cameras will turn those shadows into your witnesses." As he worked, I followed him from room to room, listening to the steady hum of drills and the click of wires being tucked neatly along edges. He showed me how each camera would feed into a secure system on my computer, complete with timestamps. "If they step foot inside, you'll have more than memory." "You'll have evidence," I nodded, clutching my handkerchief. "I don't just want to stop them. I want to show the truth." Marcus gave a short smile. "That's the spirit. A journal and cameras together. Those two are stronger than any lock. Locks can be broken, but records, they're unshakable." When he installed the last camera above the wide staircase, he motioned for me to stand at the base. "Look up," he said. On the monitor, I saw myself looking small but steady in the frame. My hands folded, the light from the tall windows spilling over me. For once, the house did not feel like a cavern swallowing me whole. It felt like a fortress under my command. While he packed his tools, Marcus paused at the doorway. "Mrs. Turner, keep a notebook by your bed. Write down the time of every call, every visit, even the cars you see parked outside. It might feel tedious, but details win battles. After he left, the mansion's silence felt different. Not hollow this time, watched, guarded, alive with unseen eyes. I carried a small journal into the kitchen and began with the simplest entry. Thursday, 2:15 p.m. Marcus installed security. House feels steady. Dorothy's still steady, too. The act of writing steadied me. I dated the top of the page, then left the notebook open on the counter like a sentinel. Each word felt like a brick in a wall I was finally building for myself. That evening, I sat in the living room and deliberately left the curtains open. The garden stretched beyond the glass, the roses swaying in the breeze. If Victor tried to peer in again, let him see me there, sitting tall, pen in hand. Let him know I was no longer an easy mark. The phone rang once around dinner time, the caller ID flashing Victor's number. I didn't answer. Instead, I wrote in my journal, 7:04 p.m. Victor called. No message left. The act of recording it drained the dread from my chest. I wasn't helpless anymore. I was building a case word by word. Before bed, I walked the halls, pausing beneath each new camera. Their quiet red lights blinked back at me like loyal guards keeping watch. In the upstairs hallway, the mirror caught me again. But this time, my reflection didn't look like a victim haunted by absence. It looked like a woman beginning to reclaim her ground. I touched the glass gently and whispered, "This is my house. And I am not done." When I finally lay down, the handkerchief rested beside my journal on the nightstand. My fortress was no longer just stone and glass. It was proof, memory, and a will that could no longer be erased. 2 days later, the phone rang again. This time, the caller ID flashed Claire's name. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen, my hand frozen above the receiver. I hadn't heard her voice in weeks without Victor's shadow looming behind it. A knot formed in my stomach, equal parts hope and dread. Finally, I answered. "Mom," she said softly, almost too gently. I was hoping we could have dinner together. Just us. No arguments, no tension. I want to fix things." The words stirred something fragile in me. It had been so long since she'd called me mom without bitterness in her tone. For an instant, I wanted to believe her. I wanted to picture us seated at the dining table, sharing a meal like we once did when Harold was alive, when life still had its simple warmth. But the echo of Victor's arrogance lingered, and Evelyn's warnings pressed into my mind. "Dinner?" I asked cautiously. "Where?" "Our place," she replied too quickly. "Victor will be there, but it's just so we can talk openly. He promises no hostility. We owe you that." The moment she said Victor will be there, my guard rose. Claire's voice trembled, but it carried the faint trace of a script, as if rehearsed. Still, I agreed, knowing Evelyn would want me to document every move. "All right," I said slowly. "I'll come." That evening, I dressed in a plain navy dress and tucked my journal into my handbag, hidden beneath my handkerchief. As I drove to their condo, the city lights blurred past me, glowing against the dark sky. I prayed silently for one thing, that my daughter's invitation was real. The moment I stepped through their door, I knew it wasn't. The table was set with plates of untouched food, too carefully arranged, the wine glasses polished to a shine. But the air didn't smell of dinner. It smelled of performance. Victor greeted me with that slick smile of his, extending his hand as though we were old friends. "Dorothy," he said warmly, but his eyes betrayed calculation. "So glad you could make it." "We've missed you." I gave him no smile in return. Claire hovered nearby, wringing her hands, her eyes darting nervously between us. She looked thinner than before, shadows beneath her eyes betraying sleepless nights. For a moment, my heart ached for her. We sat at the table, the silence brittle. Victor raised his glass. "To family," he declared. I did not lift mine. "Family is present when it matters," I said quietly. He chuckled as though I'd made a joke. "Well, we're here now." That's what counts. The conversation that followed was full of forced sweetness, Victor asking about my health, Claire murmuring agreements. But beneath it ran another current. Questions about the mansion, about bank accounts, about whether I was lonely in such a big house. Finally, Victor leaned forward, his tone softening. "Dorothy, you know maintaining that estate is difficult. It would be so much easier if we all lived there together, managed things as a family. It's what Claire wants too, isn't it?" Claire's eyes flickered, betraying conflict. She opened her mouth, then hesitated. I reached across the table, my hand hovering near hers, but she pulled back, her fingers tightening around her wineglass instead. "I managed just fine," I said firmly. "The mansion is not a burden. It is my home." Victor's smile stiffened, though he kept his voice pleasant. "But you must see how impractical it is. So much space, so much responsibility. We could relieve you of that. You could relax, travel, enjoy life. Isn't that what you want?" I set down my fork. "What I want," I said, "is honesty. This isn't about helping me. It's about helping yourselves." The words hung in the air. Claire looked down at her plate, her knuckles white around the stem of her glass. A faint tremor ran through her shoulders, and for a heartbeat, I thought she might speak up, might finally side with me. But Victor's hand rested on hers, firm and possessive, and she fell silent again. After dessert was served, a cake too rich to mask the bitterness in the room, Victor excused himself briefly. Claire leaned closer, her voice barely audible. "Mom, my credit cards, they're all maxed. He said the mansion would solve everything. I didn't know it would go this far." Her confession pierced me. For the first time, I saw the chains Victor had wrapped around her, not just emotional, but financial. She was caught in his debts, tangled in his lies. "You don't have to let him use you like this," I whispered urgently. But before she could answer, Victor returned, his smile broader than ever. The moment vanished, her lips sealing shut once more. I stayed only long enough to avoid suspicion, then rose to leave. At the door, Victor clasped my arm lightly, too firmly to be polite. "Think about what we said, Dorothy," he murmured. "You can't hold on forever." I pulled my arm free, meeting his eyes without flinching. "You'll find I can hold on longer than you think." Driving back to the mansion, I recorded everything in my journal. The set table, the probing questions, Claire's whispered admission. Each detail mattered, each word a piece of the puzzle Evelyn would need. My heart ached for my daughter, but I knew now more than ever, I was not just fighting for myself. I was fighting to free her from the grip of a man who wanted to consume us both. The morning after that uneasy dinner, I woke with a weight pressing down on me. My journal lay open on the nightstand, last night's words etched across the page like a warning. He will not stop. Claire is drowning. I must stay strong. The mansion felt heavy with the memory of Victor's hand gripping my arm, of Claire's whispered confession about her debts. For days I had lived in tension, waiting for the next intrusion. But Evelyn's advice returned to me. Take care of yourself, Dorothy. You can't fight if you're hollow inside. So I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I booked a spa appointment in town. The place was tucked away on a quiet street, its windows frosted with designs of vines and blossoms. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and eucalyptus. Gentle music drifted through the rooms, a contrast so sharp to the echoes of the mansion that I almost felt like I had stepped into another life. A young woman led me to a chair for a facial, her hands skilled and steady. As the warm cloth pressed against my skin, I felt layers of exhaustion peel away. My eyes closed, and for the first time in weeks, I let myself breathe without fear of the next phone call or knock on the door. It was in the lounge afterward, sipping chamomile tea, that I met her. Marjorie sat in the corner, her posture elegant despite her age. A silk scarf draped neatly around her shoulders. She noticed me and smiled with the kind of warmth that felt genuine, not forced. "First time here?" she asked. I nodded. "It shows, doesn't it?" She laughed softly. "No, it shows in your eyes. That look of someone who's been carrying too much." Her words startled me. Perhaps it was the calm of the spa, or the fact that I had been alone for so long, but I found myself answering honestly. "I suppose I have. Family matters. Difficult ones." Her expression grew gentle. "Ah, I know that look too well. I lost my house to my own son." The confession hung between us, startling in its bluntness. She leaned closer, her voice steady. "He manipulated me into signing papers I didn't fully understand. I thought I was protecting him, but in the end, I was only erasing myself." I felt my chest tighten. That's exactly what they tried to do to me. My son-in-law, with my daughter standing by him, Marjorie placed her teacup down carefully. "Then you are not alone. It happens more than people admit. Children, or their spouses, convinced they are entitled to what we built. They call it family. But family does not strip you of your dignity." Her words echoed my own unspoken thoughts, and for the first time I felt seen, not just as a mother, but as a woman enduring something far larger than personal betrayal. "I'm fighting back," I said quietly. "I found a lawyer, and I'm documenting everything. They won't get my house." Her eyes brightened. "Good. That's what I wish I had done. If I'd had Evelyn back then, maybe things would have been different." I blinked. "You know Evelyn Carter?" She smiled. "Of course. She's one of the best. She helped a friend of mine recover her guardianship after her own daughter tried to claim she was incompetent. If you're working with Evelyn, you're in capable hands." Something in me eased, hearing that confirmation. Then maybe I do have a chance. Marjorie leaned forward, her scarf slipping slightly as she rested a hand on mine. "You have more than a chance. You have strength. I can see it in you. And you have something else, a choice. To surround yourself with people who understand, who will stand with you, even when blood doesn't." Her words settled deep inside me. A chosen family. Not the one tied by blood or marriage, but the one tied by shared pain and chosen loyalty. When I left the spa that afternoon, my skin felt lighter. But more importantly, so did my spirit. I exchanged numbers with Marjorie, her name neatly written on a small card she pressed into my hand. "Call me," she said. "Anytime. Even if it's just to sit in silence back at the mansion, the air didn't feel quite so heavy." I placed her card beside my journal and my handkerchief, the 3 items forming a small altar of resolve. Then I went to the mirror in the hallway. My reflection looked almost the same, lined, weary. But my eyes had changed. They carried something steadier now, a trace of the solidarity Marjorie had gifted me. I whispered to the glass, "I am not alone anymore." For the first time in weeks, I believed it. The following week, the rain returned. Heavy drops pounded against the windows of the mansion, each gust of wind rattling the shutters like a warning. I had spent the morning writing in my journal, noting small details, calls from unknown numbers, cars idling too long at the edge of the driveway. Evelyn had told me these things mattered. "Patterns are proof," she said. Still, I wasn't prepared for what happened that night. It was close to midnight when the sound of the front gate creaking open jolted me awake. I slipped from bed, the handkerchief in my palm, and padded softly down the hall. Through the narrow window by the staircase, I saw them. Victor, holding an umbrella low against the rain, his arm around Claire. They moved quickly up the steps, and then came the unmistakable scrape of a key failing in the lock. My breath caught. He still thought he could force his way in. I didn't hesitate this time. I pressed the emergency button Marcus had installed near the door, alerting both the cameras and the local police. Then, with trembling hands, I called 911. "This is Dorothy Turner," I said, my voice shaking but clear. "My son-in-law and daughter are trying to enter my home without permission. I need officers here immediately." The dispatcher's calm voice reassured me. Help was on the way. I clutched the handkerchief tighter and waited, listening to Victor's muffled curses outside. Claire's voice was softer, pleading, but I couldn't make out the words. The cameras caught it all: the rain, the failed attempts at the lock, the frustration in Victor's movements. When the red and blue lights finally flickered across the wet lawn, Victor stepped back, his expression unreadable. Claire tugged at his arm, urging him toward the car. They slipped into the vehicle just as two officers approached the porch. "Mrs. Turner?" one asked gently. "Are you all right?" "Yes," I managed, though my legs trembled beneath me. "But they keep trying." "They won't stop." The officers inspected the doorframe, then viewed the footage Marcus's system had captured. One officer shook his head. "This is clear trespassing. You should file for a restraining order. It'll give us stronger grounds to protect you." The next morning, Evelyn met me at the courthouse. She looked crisp and composed despite the early hour, her briefcase tucked under her arm. "Dorothy, this is exactly why we prepared," she said firmly. "We'll file today. They can't continue harassing you like this." The paperwork felt endless: forms, signatures, descriptions of each incident. But Evelyn guided me through with steady patience. At one point, she placed her hand over mine and said, "This isn't just ink on paper. This is your boundary. This is you drawing the line they cannot cross." In the courtroom, the judge reviewed the evidence. The video from the cameras played on the small monitor, showing Victor jiggling the lock, Claire hovering uncertainly beside him. The judge's face hardened. "Unacceptable," he muttered. After a pause, he looked directly at me. "Mrs. Turner, you have every right to feel safe in your home. This order will keep them at a distance until a full hearing is scheduled." The gavel struck, and with it, a weight lifted from my shoulders. For the first time, the law was no longer an abstract hope. It was a shield with edges Victor could not simply brush aside. Outside the courthouse, Claire lingered by the steps, her coat pulled tight against the drizzle. For a heartbeat, our eyes met. She looked pale, worn, as though she hadn't slept in days. I waited, wondering if she would speak, if she would take even one step toward me. But Victor's car pulled up to the curb, and he shouted her name sharply. She flinched, turned away, and climbed in. The door slammed, leaving the echo of her silence in the air. Back at the mansion, I placed the court papers in the drawer with the bank documents and my journal. Each layer was becoming stronger: evidence, allies, now the law itself. I stood in front of the mirror in the hallway, my reflection faint in the dim light. For once, it didn't accuse me of mistakes or sacrifices. It nodded back, steady and unbroken. That night, as I prepared for bed, I looked out the window at the rain-soaked garden. The roses bent under the weight of the storm, their petals battered but still clinging to the stems. I thought of myself in those roses, bent, bruised but not uprooted, and I whispered into the quiet, "You will not take me down." Not in my own home. When I closed my journal for the night, the last words I wrote were simple: restraining order granted. Dorothy still standing. The restraining order was still fresh in my hands when the knock came the following week. Not the frantic pounding of Victor's fists or the sly rattle of a key in the lock, but the official, measured knock of someone who belonged to the system. When I opened the door, a man in a gray suit stood there, his badge displayed neatly. He introduced himself as Franklin, a social worker. His tone was courteous, but his eyes carried a practiced neutrality I had seen in others whose job was to weigh truths against lies. "Mrs. Turner," he said evenly, "I received a report expressing concerns about your ability to manage your affairs. I need to conduct an evaluation and a home visit." The words stung, though I had been expecting something like this since Evelyn first warned me. Of course, Victor would not sit idle after being turned away by the police. If he couldn't force me to sign, he would paint me as incapable. "Please, come in," I replied, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. Franklin stepped inside, his eyes scanning the mansion with quick professional glances. "I understand this is inconvenient," he said, "but we take all reports seriously. Do you mind answering a few questions?" I led him to the living room, where the cameras Marcus had installed blinked silently from the corners. I had already opened my journal on the coffee table, its neat handwriting chronicling the calls, the visits, the attempted break-ins. "Of course," I said, gesturing for him to sit. He pulled out a notepad. "Can you tell me how you've been managing your daily activities, cooking, paying bills, handling medications?" I met his eyes directly. "I've managed this house alone since my husband passed. I still cook my meals, balance my checkbook, and maintain every account myself. My lawyer can provide full documentation if you'd like." At the mention of Evelyn, his brows lifted slightly. "You have representation?" "Yes," I said firmly, "and she told me this might happen." As if on cue, the front door opened, and Evelyn herself stepped inside. She had insisted I call her the moment anything like this occurred. Today, she wore a dark suit, her presence calm but commanding. "Mr. Franklin," she greeted politely, extending her hand. "I'm Mrs. Turner's attorney. I'll be present for this evaluation." For a moment, Franklin looked caught off guard, but then he nodded. "Of course." What followed felt like a battle fought with sentences instead of swords. Franklin asked about my health, my finances, even my memory of current events. Each time I answered clearly, grounding myself in details: the date on the restraining order, the exact amount of my last withdrawal, the groceries I had purchased that week. Evelyn reinforced my responses with documents, producing bank statements, receipts, and the copy of the court order like armor laid piece by piece. At one point, Franklin glanced at his notes and said carefully, "The report I received claimed you've been confused, forgetting important matters, even leaving the stove on. Have there been incidents like that?" My pulse quickened, but Evelyn leaned forward before I could speak. "Mr. Franklin, let me remind you that false reports are a common tactic in financial exploitation cases. What you see before you, her journals, her security footage, her banking documents, shows clarity, not confusion. I would encourage you to weigh the evidence, not hearsay." Franklin studied me, then the papers. I folded my hands tightly, the handkerchief pressed between my palms. "I am 71, I said steadily. "I forget small things sometimes, like anyone. But I do not forget who I am. And I will not forget who is trying to take what I've built." The silence that followed was heavy, but it was not the silence of weakness. It was the silence of truth landing where it needed to. After nearly an hour, Franklin closed his notebook. "Mrs. Turner, thank you for your time. Based on what I've seen today, I don't believe there is evidence to support the claims made against you. I will file my report accordingly." Relief washed through me, though I kept my composure. Evelyn walked him to the door, thanking him for his professionalism. When the door closed, she turned to me with a small smile. "You handled that beautifully, Dorothy. They thought words could paint you as weak, but you've shown words can also defend." I sank into the armchair, exhaustion settling into my bones. "It feels like they'll never stop." "They won't," Evelyn agreed softly. "Not until they realize you're stronger than their lies. But today, you've gained ground. Don't underestimate what that means." That night, I wrote in my journal again. They tried to use words to erase me, but today, words became my shield. Dorothy still standing. I laid the pen down, folded the handkerchief carefully, and placed it on the page as though sealing my testimony. The mansion around me felt steady once more, its silence no longer haunted, but fortified by truth. After Franklin left and Evelyn assured me the report would close in my favor, the house grew quiet again. That night, while the rain softened into a mist outside, I found myself wandering upstairs to Claire's old bedroom. I hadn't stepped inside for months. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the scent of lavender sachets still lingered faintly, as if time had preserved her childhood there. The room looked almost untouched. Posters from her teenage years clung to the walls, their corners curling, and a shelf lined with old storybooks leaned against the far side. I crossed to the dresser, where a small wooden jewelry box still sat. When I lifted the lid, I found a tiny silver locket inside, one Harold had given her for her 10th birthday. My hand trembled as I held it, remembering the way she had squealed with delight, running to show me how it caught the light. I sat on the edge of her bed and let the memories come. Claire at 5 years old, running across the yard with her braids flying, clutching the handkerchief I had embroidered with small flowers. She had fallen earlier that day, scraping her knee, and I had pressed the cloth against her tear-streaked face. "It smells like you, Mommy," she'd whispered, tucking it into her pocket as if it could protect her from the world. I remembered the nights she couldn't sleep during thunderstorms. She would pad down the hall in her pajamas, climb into my bed, and hide beneath the covers until I sang her favorite lullaby. Her small hands had always reached for mine, clinging as though the warmth alone could keep the fear away. And I remembered her teenage years, when things grew more complicated. She would slam doors, roll her eyes, insist she didn't need me. But even then, I would find her late at night, sitting at the kitchen table with her homework spread out, quietly asking for help with equations she pretended to understand. Each time, I would sit beside her, patient, knowing that beneath her defiance still beat the same heart that once clutched my handkerchief. Holding the locket now, I felt tears blur my eyes. How had that little girl become the woman who stood silent while her husband shut me out? How had she let herself be silenced? I touched the mirror above her dresser and stared at my reflection. In the glass, I saw not only myself, but faint echoes of Claire as a child, her laughter bouncing through the halls, her voice calling for me. The ache in my chest deepened. I wanted to reach back through time, to remind her of who we had been before greed and fear bound her to Victor. "Claire," I whispered to the empty room, "you were once my whole world. I don't know when I lost you, but I still remember the little girl who held my handkerchief and believed I could keep her safe." I placed the locket gently back in the jewelry box and closed it with care, as though sealing away the memory itself. Then I folded the bedspread neatly, a small act of order against the chaos of the present. Back in the hallway, the mansion felt heavier with silence, but the memories remained alive inside me. They were not only reminders of what I had lost, but of why I could not give up. If I surrendered, I would not only be betraying myself, I would be betraying that little girl who once trusted me completely. That night, I wrote in my journal, "I still fight for her, for the child she once was, for the woman she might still be." The summons arrived in a thick envelope, its seal pressed with the county court's insignia. My hand shook as I slid it open, though deep inside I had known it was coming. Victor had filed a petition declaring me incompetent to manage my own affairs. Reading the words on the page felt like swallowing glass. He had turned my age into a weapon, my years of endurance into evidence against me. I sat at the kitchen table with the papers spread before me, the morning light filtering through lace curtains. The mansion's silence pressed in on me, but this time I wasn't truly alone. Evelyn sat across from me, her glasses perched low as she scanned the petition line by line. She frowned, tapping the paper with her pen. "They've claimed you're forgetful, prone to confusion, unable to handle finances. Classic tactics. But Dorothy, we're ready for this. We'll fight them in court." Her certainty steadied me. "I've lived in this house for decades," I said quietly. "I've balanced every account, paid every bill. How can they erase that with a few sentences?" "They can't," Evelyn replied firmly. "Not if we show the truth. You've already built a wall of proof. Your journal, your bank records, your security footage. Now we'll build higher." In the days that followed, my home became a war room. Evelyn visited often, gathering evidence. She studied the footage Marcus had set up, the recordings of Victor rattling the lock, of Claire hovering in silence, of Denton's voice urging me to sign away my life. She stacked documents in careful order, each one a brick in the fortress we were constructing. Meanwhile, I prepared myself. I practiced answering questions, recalling details with precision. The date Harold died, the year Claire graduated, the last time I paid the property taxes. Each memory was not just recollection, it was defiance. One evening, Evelyn leaned across the table. "Dorothy, they'll try to rattle you. Denton will argue you're confused. Victor will paint you as frail. But remember, clarity is your greatest defense. Speak simply, speak truth. Don't let them lure you into anger. Your calm will undo them." I nodded, clutching my handkerchief in my lap. Its threads were thinning now, but it held me steady. Each stitch reminded me of the child I had raised, the legacy I refused to surrender. The day of the first hearing arrived cold and gray. I dressed in my best suit, the one I had worn to Harold's funeral, not out of mourning this time, but out of resolve. Evelyn met me at the courthouse steps, her briefcase in one hand, her other hand resting gently on my arm. "You are stronger than they know," she whispered. Inside, the air buzzed with tension. Victor sat at the opposite table, his posture confident, his arm draped possessively over the back of Claire's chair. Claire's eyes flickered toward me once, a flash of shame quickly buried beneath lowered lashes. Denton stood beside them, his smirk thin and sharp. The judge entered, and the room hushed. My heart pounded, but when Evelyn rose to speak on my behalf, her voice was steady as steel. She laid out the evidence clearly: my revoked powers of attorney, the restraining order, the video footage. Piece by piece, she dismantled the portrait they had tried to paint of me. Victor shifted uneasily, and Denton whispered hurriedly in his ear. Claire's hands twisted in her lap. When the judge finally spoke, his tone was even but firm. "We will continue this hearing with additional testimony. But based on this evidence presented today, Mrs. Turner appears competent and prepared." The gavel struck once. The sound rang like a small victory. Outside, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Evelyn placed a hand on my shoulder. "This is just the beginning, Dorothy. But today, you've stood your ground, and they know it." I looked back at the courthouse steps where Victor and Claire lingered, his grip tight on her arm, her eyes avoiding mine. The battle had begun, but I was ready. The next hearing came faster than I expected. Evelyn warned me that Victor's side would not waste time. They would arrive with witnesses, stories carefully twisted, every word sharpened to paint me as incapable. Even so, nothing prepared me for the sting of betrayal when I stepped into the courtroom and saw who stood waiting. Edgar, my neighbor of 15 years, shuffled nervously on the stand. He avoided my eyes, clutching his hat in his hands. Denton guided him with leading questions, each one nudging him closer to lies. "Would you say Mrs. Turner sometimes behaves erratically?" Denton asked. Edgar cleared his throat. "I've seen her, talking to herself in the garden. Wandering late at night, sometimes leaving lights on all night long." The courtroom murmured. My hands clenched around the handkerchief hidden in my lap. Talking to myself? Those late-night walks had been my solace, my way of breathing through grief. He had turned healing into madness. Evelyn rose. "Mr. Edgar, is it unusual for someone who lives alone to speak aloud in their own garden? Or to leave a light on for comfort?" Edgar hesitated, his lips pressed tight, but Denton quickly interjected. No further questions. Then came the pharmacist, Mr. Green. He adjusted his tie, clearly uncomfortable, as Denton presented a signed statement claiming I had misused medication, ordering refills too frequently, suggesting confusion or decline. "Mr. Green," Evelyn asked on cross-examination, "did you personally witness Mrs. Turner misusing her prescriptions?" He shifted in his seat. "No. I only signed the statement because Victor assured me it was routine." The judge leaned forward. "You signed without verifying the facts?" Mr. Green's face reddened. I suppose I did." For the first time, Victor's polished mask cracked, his jaw tightening as murmurs rippled again through the room. Evelyn's calm gaze met mine, reassuring. One brick of their false wall had crumbled. Still, the damage weighed heavy. To hear neighbors and professionals twist my life into weakness was like being erased piece by piece. When the session adjourned, I walked slowly down the courthouse steps, the air thick with drizzle. Evelyn placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "Dorothy, remember, lies leave cracks. Today, we saw one. Next time, we'll widen it." I nodded, gripping my handkerchief tighter. The threads were worn now, but still whole, like me. They could distort testimonies, but truth had a way of waiting patiently, ready to surface. That evening, I sat at my desk and wrote in my journal. They try to break me with words, but even bent words cannot erase the truth. Dorothy's still standing. A week after the distorted testimonies, a letter arrived from the court. It ordered me to undergo a formal evaluation with a neurologist, a standard procedure when guardianship was contested. My hands trembled as I read it, though not from fear of the test itself. I had lived on my own for decades, managing every detail of my life. What unsettled me was the knowledge that Victor would twist even this into another weapon if he could. Evelyn accompanied me to the appointment. Dr. Harper greeted us in a quiet office lined with books and certificates. She was a middle-aged woman with a calm demeanor, her voice steady and unhurried. "Mrs. Turner," she said warmly, "I understand this evaluation is stressful, but I promise you it's not an interrogation. I only want to see how you think, remember, and manage daily life." I nodded, folding my handkerchief in my lap like an anchor. The test began with simple questions. "What is today's date? Who is the current president?" My answers came swiftly. She asked me to recall 3 words: rose, penny, candle, and repeat them later. I held them in my mind like treasures. Then came arithmetic, recalling sequences of numbers, drawing a clock face with hands at a certain time. My pencil pressed firmly against the paper, my lines sure. When she asked me to explain how I would balance a checkbook or plan a weekly grocery trip, I described each step clearly, even reciting the exact prices of staples I had bought the day before. Throughout it all, Evelyn sat quietly in the corner, her presence steadying me. I could feel Victor's shadow lurking beyond these walls, but here, with this woman's kind eyes watching me work, I remembered who I was: capable, precise, resilient. After nearly an hour, Dr. Harper set down her clipboard. "Mrs. Turner," she said gently, "your results are excellent. There are no signs of cognitive decline. Your memory, reasoning, and problem-solving are strong." Relief flooded me so suddenly I had to grip the armrest to steady myself. Evelyn's smile widened, her eyes shining with quiet triumph. Still, Dr. Harper's voice carried a note of warning. "Be prepared. Those who seek control may not accept results that contradict their claims, but you have nothing to fear from this report. It speaks clearly for you." As we left her office, Evelyn whispered, "Victor won't like this. He'll try something else. But Dorothy, this is a victory, and it's ours." That evening, I stood in front of the hallway mirror once again. My reflection met me with tired but steady eyes. "You passed," I whispered, not just to myself, but to the house, to Harold's memory, to the little girl Claire once was. "They cannot call you weak." Not anymore. I placed my handkerchief carefully back on the dresser and wrote in my journal, "Capacity test completed. Results strong. Dorothy still standing." A few evenings after the evaluation, Marjorie called. Her voice carried the kind of steadiness that only comes from shared experience. "Dorothy," she said, "some of us are meeting tomorrow at the community hall. People like us. I think you should come. The next day I drove across town, the autumn light slanting low across the streets. The community hall was small, its brick walls weathered, but warmth greeted me the moment I stepped inside. A circle of chairs had been arranged, and faces turned toward me with gentle recognition. Marjorie waved me over, her scarf bright against her dark coat. "This is Dorothy," she introduced, pride in her voice. "She's fighting too." I sat among them. Cynthia, who had lost her savings to a son who forged her name. Maria, who had been pressured into selling her home. Carmen, who fought off relatives trying to seize her late husband's pension. Elfrida, whose daughter drained her retirement account in secret. Each of them carried scars, but each spoke with strength that rose from survival. As the stories unfolded, I felt less alone than I had in months. Their voices blended into a chorus of resilience. When it was my turn, I told them about Victor, about Claire's silence, about the mansion they tried to strip from me. My voice trembled at first, but steadied as I described the cameras, the journal, Evelyn's sharp defense. When I finished, the women leaned closer. Cynthia reached for my hand. "You're not alone, Dorothy. We are your family too." Tears burned my eyes, not from sorrow, but from relief. For the first time, I felt surrounded by people who understood without judgment. Later that evening, after most had left, Marjorie lingered with me. The hall was quiet, chairs stacked, the smell of coffee lingering. She placed her hand gently on my arm. "You see? Blood isn't the only bond. Sometimes family is chosen, built from those who refuse to let you fall." Before I could reply, I noticed movement near the door. Claire stood there, half hidden in the shadow of the doorway. Her eyes glistened, and for a moment she looked like the girl who once clutched my handkerchief in storms. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I never wanted this. I don't know how to fight him." My chest ached. I wanted to rise, to fold her into my arms, but she glanced behind her nervously as if Victor's shadow still hovered nearby. "I can't stay," she said quickly. "I just needed you to know." And then she was gone, slipping into the night before I could answer. Marjorie's eyes met mine, steady and knowing. "She still loves you," she said softly, "but she's trapped. Let her come in her own time." I nodded, pressing my handkerchief against my lips, breathing in the faint scent of fabric and memory. Claire's fleeting words pierced me with both hope and sorrow, but the circle of chosen family around me gave me the strength to hold both at once. That night, back in the mansion, I wrote in my journal, "Claire came. She said she's sorry. Chosen family surrounds me. Dorothy still standing." Sunday morning dawned cool and gray, the kind of day Harold always loved for long walks. I wrapped a scarf around my shoulders and drove to the cemetery where he had been laid to rest almost 20 years ago. The air smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves, and the hush of the grounds felt sacred, as though time itself slowed there. I carried with me 3 things: my journal, the handkerchief, and a single white rose from the garden outside the mansion. As I walked along the gravel path, my steps echoed softly. When I reached his headstone, I knelt and traced his name carved in stone: Harold Turner, beloved husband and father. For a moment, the weight of everything pressed down on me. I thought of the wedding I had been excluded from, of Victor's arrogance, of Claire's silence. I thought of the mansion, that fortress Harold had built with years of saving, and how easily others had tried to claim it. My voice trembled as I whispered, "Harold, they're trying to take it all. They think I'm too old, too weak, too broken to fight. But I've stood my ground. I laid the rose at the base of the stone and unfolded the handkerchief, pressing it against my cheek. You always believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. You told me this house would outlive us both, and you told me I was stronger than I knew. I hold on to that now. I promise you, I won't surrender, not to Victor, not to anyone. A gust of wind rustled the trees overhead, scattering golden leaves across the grass. It felt like an answer, as though Harold himself was standing near, listening. I opened my journal and read aloud some of the entries, the record of every intrusion, every call, every attempt to erase me. This is my testimony, Harold. Each word proves that I'm still here, still fighting. My throat tightened, but I pushed on. I won't let them twist your legacy into their greed. I'll protect it, just as you asked me to protect our daughter. Even if she has lost her way, I will not lose mine. Tears blurred my vision. I rested my palm against the cold stone and closed my eyes. If you can hear me, just give me the strength to see this through. I don't need victory for pride's sake. I need it so they know I cannot be erased. For a long while I sat in silence, the cemetery quiet except for the rustle of leaves. Peace slowly seeped into me, a steadiness that anchored my vow. I rose finally, folding the handkerchief carefully and tucking it into my coat pocket. As I walked back to the car, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The white rose glowed against the gray stone, a symbol of endurance. I whispered, "Rest easy, Harold. I'll carry this fight until it's finished." Driving away, I felt lighter, as if some of my burden had been left there with him. My promise had been spoken into the earth, binding me to the man who once believed I could weather any storm. That night, in my journal, I wrote, "Promise made at Harold's grave. I will protect what we built." Dorothy still standing. The day of the trial arrived cold and bright, the courthouse standing like a fortress of stone against the pale sky. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a charcoal suit with a simple pearl brooch Harold had once given me. As I fastened it, I whispered to my reflection in the mirror, "This is not the end of me. This is the proof of me." Then I tucked my handkerchief into my purse, folded neatly, a hidden anchor for the storm ahead. Inside the courthouse, the air buzzed with restrained energy. Wooden benches filled with strangers, reporters scribbling in notepads, the hum of voices rising and falling like restless waves. Evelyn walked beside me, her stride steady, her presence a shield. When we entered the courtroom, all eyes turned. On the opposite side sat Victor and Claire. He looked immaculate, his jaw set with smug certainty, while Claire's gaze stayed low, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked smaller than I remembered, as though the weight of her silence had diminished her. Denton rose first, adjusting his tie before addressing the judge. His voice carried smooth confidence. "Your Honor, this case concerns the well-being of Mrs. Dorothy Turner. Our position is that she is no longer capable of managing her affairs responsibly. We intend to show that her actions are erratic, her memory unreliable, and her judgment compromised. For her safety and the protection of family assets, we seek guardianship." His words landed like blows, each one attempting to chip away at my identity. I sat still, my hands folded around the purse on my lap, refusing to let him see the tremor in my fingers. Then Evelyn stood. Her voice was clear, sharp with conviction. "Your Honor, what you will see in this courtroom is not a frail woman incapable of managing her life, but a mother targeted for exploitation by those who should have stood beside her. We will present evidence, financial records, eyewitness accounts, security footage that proves not only Mrs. Turner's competence, but also the calculated efforts of Mr. Victor Hayes to seize control of assets that are not his to claim. Her words steadied me like a hand on my shoulder. The judge nodded, gesturing for the first witness. To my horror, Victor's legal team played a short video clip. On the screen, I appeared in my garden late one night, speaking softly to myself, the glow of the porch light illuminating my face. Denton's voice rang out. "See how she wanders, speaking to no one? This is evidence of confusion, of diminished capacity." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. My heart hammered, but Evelyn stood swiftly. "Your Honor, this footage is selectively cut. What you do not see is Mrs. Turner journaling each evening, recording details at her lawyer's instruction. Nor do you see that her late-night walks were recommended for health. Context matters." The judge leaned forward. "Does the defense have the full recording?" Evelyn nodded, already producing a flash drive. "We do, Your Honor. You'll see Mrs. Turner return inside, write clearly in her journal, and secure her home. Evidence of awareness and responsibility, not decline." Victor shifted uncomfortably, and Claire's eyes flickered briefly toward me, guilt etched across her face. As the first day of testimony closed, I remained seated, my hand resting over my purse where the handkerchief lay. My body was weary, but my spirit remained intact. The court had seen only the opening blows, yet Evelyn had parried them with precision. Walking out into the crisp afternoon air, I breathed deeply. The battle had begun, but I was not walking into it as prey. I was standing as the woman Harold once told me I was, resilient, capable, and unwilling to be erased. That night in my journal, I wrote, "Trial opened, lies presented, truth already breaking through, Dorothy still standing." The second day of the trial began with the same heavy air of anticipation. I sat straight in my chair, my handkerchief folded neatly in my purse, its presence giving me strength. Victor looked confident again, leaning back with his arms stretched arrogantly along the bench. Claire sat beside him, her eyes darting nervously between the judge and the floor. Denton opened the morning session with more accusations. He spoke of my supposed decline, waving papers that twisted small mistakes into damning evidence. "Your Honor, Mrs. Turner's forgetfulness is dangerous. She cannot be trusted with large assets like a $10 million mansion." I stayed silent, my eyes fixed on Evelyn. She rose slowly, her calm presence commanding attention. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady. "Yesterday, we heard claims about confusion and decline. Today, we bring something much stronger than words. Evidence." She walked to the center of the courtroom, a small device in her hand. "We will now present security footage from inside Mrs. Turner's home, collected by cameras installed for her protection. These recordings will show precisely who is confused and who is calculated." The lights dimmed slightly as the screen flickered on. The footage played, clear and undeniable. There was Victor, standing in my living room late at night, his voice low but sharp. "We need to push harder," he told Claire. "She won't last long. If we get her signature, the house is ours." The courtroom gasped. On the screen, Claire shifted uncomfortably, whispering, "But what if she refuses? She's not as weak as you think." Victor's reply was cold. "Then we'll make her look weak. We'll make the court believe it." The footage ended, and silence fell heavy over the room. Evelyn let it linger before speaking again. This is not the behavior of a family concerned for an elder's well-being. This is exploitation, manipulation, and deceit. The cameras do not lie, Victor's mask cracked. He shifted in his seat, his face pale with fury. Denton jumped to his feet, objecting, scrambling for excuses, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. This evidence will be admitted. Continue. Miss Carter Evelyn nodded, her tone firm. What you have just seen confirms everything Mrs. Turner has endured. This is not incompetence. This is resilience in the face of betrayal. This woman has safeguarded her home, her dignity, and her rights, and she has done so while her own family plotted against her. Claire's face crumpled, tears slipping down her cheeks. For the first time, she looked directly at me. There was pain in her eyes, but also something else. Recognition. Perhaps she finally saw the cost of her silence. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice cutting through the tense air. "Do you understand the seriousness of what we have just seen?" Victor clenched his jaw but said nothing. The gavel struck lightly. "We will recess. But know this, the court does not take kindly to deceit." As the room emptied, Evelyn placed a reassuring hand on mine. "Dorothy, that was the turning point. Today they saw who he really is." I nodded, tears burning behind my eyes. For the first time in weeks, I felt not just defended, but vindicated. That evening, back at the mansion, I stood in front of the mirror. My reflection looked weary, but behind the lines of age was a strength that no one could deny. I whispered, "You tried to erase me, but the truth speaks louder than your lies." In my journal, I wrote, "Camera revealed the plot. Courtroom saw the truth. Dorothy still standing." The third morning of the trial dawned with a stillness that felt like the pause before a storm. I dressed slowly, slipping into a dark blue suit. The color Harold once said brought out the steadiness in my eyes. I placed the handkerchief in my pocket, folded with care, its fabric soft and worn. It had been with me in moments of tenderness and betrayal, and now it would steady me in front of the court. The courtroom was hushed as I took the stand. My palms felt damp, but I kept them folded over the handkerchief in my lap, drawing strength from the stitches I once sewed by lamplight. The judge nodded, and Evelyn gave me a small, encouraging smile before stepping aside. Denton began his questioning, his tone smooth but sharp underneath. "Mrs. Turner," he said, "do you often forget things? Dates, appointments, names?" I met his gaze directly. "I remember what matters. I remember every date Victor tried to enter my home. I remember every dollar I gave to help my daughter. I remember every night I lay awake wondering why my family had turned against me." A murmur stirred through the gallery. Denton pressed on. "Would you say you sometimes become confused, perhaps even disoriented?" I unfolded the handkerchief and held it lightly, the embroidered flowers visible to all. This was my daughter's when she was a child. She carried it in storms, when she was afraid. She believed I could protect her. I remember the day she tucked it into her pocket, her eyes wide with trust. That memory has never left me. I am not confused. I am not lost. I am a mother who remembers too much. For a moment, the silence in the courtroom was so complete, it seemed the walls themselves were listening. Claire's shoulders shook, her face buried in her hands. Evelyn rose then, her voice gentle. "Dorothy, can you tell the court why you have taken these steps to defend yourself?" I drew a slow breath. "Because I gave everything I had to my daughter and her husband. Because I thought love was enough. But when they locked me out of her wedding, when they called me less than family, when they tried to strip my home from me, I realized silence would destroy me. I came here not only to protect a house of stone and wood, but to protect the dignity I still carry. Tears blurred my vision, but I held steady. I am 71 years old, Your Honor. I may be slower to climb stairs or to lift heavy things, but I am not weak. My mind is sharp, my will is strong, and I will not be erased. The judge's eyes softened as he regarded me. Thank you, Mrs. Turner. As I stepped down from the stand, Evelyn's hand brushed mine, a silent acknowledgement that the testimony had landed exactly as it needed to. Behind me, I heard Claire's muffled sobs, her voice breaking in a whisper only I could catch. Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't turn. Not yet. Some apologies were too late, and some had to wait until the fight was finished. That night, back in the mansion, I laid the handkerchief across my journal before writing. I spoke. The court listened. My words carried more than defense. They carried truth. Dorothy still standing. The final day of the trial arrived with a quiet weight, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. I dressed with deliberate care, slipping into a gray suit that once belonged to a happier time, when Harold and I attended our daughter's graduation. The handkerchief was folded neatly in my pocket, its presence a reminder that some things endure no matter how much others try to erase them. The courtroom was fuller than before. Word had spread, and the benches were lined with strangers, advocates, even a few faces from the community who had suffered similar battles. In the second row, Marjorie sat tall, flanked by Cynthia, Maria, Carmen, and Alfreda. Their presence filled me with a warmth that steadied my steps. Victor appeared confident at first. His tie knotted too tightly, his jaw tense. Claire sat beside him, her face pale, her hands twisting in her lap. She didn't look at me, but I could feel her trembling. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. Papers rustled, breaths were held. Evelyn rose, her voice clear and strong. Your Honor, this case has never been about incapacity. It has been about control, about a man who sought to strip a woman of her dignity, her home, and her autonomy. But the evidence speaks louder than his words. Mrs. Turner is competent, she is resilient, and she has faced exploitation at the hands of those who should have loved her most. Denton followed, his tone still slick, but there was a tremor now. Your Honor, we maintain that Mrs. Turner's judgment is impaired, that her decisions place the estate in jeopardy. The judge lifted his hand. I've heard enough. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. My fingers gripped the edge of the table, the handkerchief pressed against my palm. Having reviewed the evidence, Judge Miller said firmly, it is the ruling of this court that Mrs. Dorothy Turner is fully competent to manage her own affairs. The petition for guardianship is denied. Furthermore, the court recognizes clear evidence of undue influence and attempted exploitation. Measures will be taken to ensure Mrs. Turner's continued protection. The gavel struck, and the sound reverberated through the chamber like thunder. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Evelyn smiled at me, her eyes shining with quiet triumph. Around the room there was movement. Marjorie and the others rising, clapping softly at first, then with growing strength. The sound spread, not formal applause, but the collective affirmation of women who understood. I felt arms around me as Marjorie pushed through the crowd. You did it, Dorothy, she whispered fiercely. Cynthia and Maria joined, their embrace firm, Carmen and Alfreda close behind. For the first time in months, I felt held, not by obligation or expectation, but by choice, by solidarity. Across the room, Victor sat stone-faced, his eyes dark with fury. Claire wept openly now, her face buried in her hands. I didn't look away, but I didn't approach her either. This was not the moment for reconciliation. It was the moment for truth to stand unshaken. As we left the courthouse, the autumn sun broke through the clouds. The light caught the windows and spilled onto the steps, where my chosen family clustered around me, their warmth chasing away the chill. Cameras flashed in the distance, reporters shouted questions, but I heard none of it. All I heard was the steady beat of my own heart, whispering, Dorothy still standing. That night, back at the mansion, I placed the court papers in the drawer with my journal, the handkerchief resting on top. My fortress was no longer just walls of stone and wood. It was proof, community, and the unyielding truth of survival. In my journal, I wrote, "The court believed, the petition denied. My chosen family rose beside me. Dorothy still standing. The trial was behind me, the papers sealed, the judgment final. For the first time in months, the mansion breathed differently. The air felt lighter, no longer weighed down by the threat of being taken from me. I walked through its halls slowly, touching the walls, the banister, the windowsills. They were mine again, not just in law, but in spirit. Yet victory carried its own kind of silence. Evelyn had urged me to consider what came next. The mansion was large, too large for one person, and I had begun to think she was right. A house built for a family had become a fortress, and though it had served its purpose, I no longer needed to fight within these walls. I needed freedom. So I made a decision. Within weeks, I listed the mansion for sale. The sum it fetched was more than enough to secure my future. I donated a portion to charities that supported women facing exploitation. The rest placed safely in my accounts. The house had been a battlefield. Now it would become someone else's dream, not my cage. The day the papers were signed, I stood in front of the mirror one last time. My reflection met me calmly. No trembling hands, no shadow of doubt. Only a woman who had faced down betrayal and endured. I whispered, "You kept your promise, Harold. You can rest." Not long after, Claire asked to meet me. Her message was short, almost timid. "Please, just once, alone." I agreed, though my heart tightened with the weight of what it might mean. We met in a quiet cafe on the edge of town. She arrived late, her shoulders hunched, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. When she sat across from me, she didn't look like the triumphant bride I had once imagined. She looked like a daughter lost, stripped of certainty. "Mom," she said softly, her voice cracking, "I'm sorry." I let him control me. I let fear control me. I should have protected you, not stood by him. Tears slipped down her cheeks, her hands twisting in her lap like a child awaiting punishment. "Can you ever forgive me?" The cafe seemed to fade into silence. I studied her face, searching for the little girl who once tucked my embroidered handkerchief into her pocket on stormy nights. I saw flashes of her there, buried beneath regret. But forgiveness is not something that can be summoned on command. The wound was too deep, the silence too long. My lips parted, but no words came. Instead, I rose slowly, placed a few bills on the table for my tea, and gathered my coat. Claire's eyes followed me, wide and pleading. "Mom, please." I rested my hand briefly on the back of her chair, a gesture neither harsh nor tender. Then I walked away, the bell over the cafe door chiming softly as I stepped into the cool evening air. Some things could not be undone. That night, in my new apartment, smaller but filled with light, I opened my journal for the final time in this chapter. I placed the handkerchief across the page and wrote, "The mansion is gone. Claire asked forgiveness. I gave her silence. Dorothy still standing. The story was not about vengeance or loss anymore. It was about survival, about choosing dignity even when love faltered. And as I closed the journal, I felt a strange peace. The scars would remain, but so would the strength. Dorothy still standing.